All right, guys, we're in lesson 3 of Unit 6, Genetics. I have to tell you something. Lesson 3, it's going to get a little bit confusing. If you are still not sure about Punnett squares, what's an allele, dominant and recessive characteristics, heterozygous, homozygous, all of those, phenotype, genotype, all any of that stuff is still just like, Wetzel, I don't get it. You have to go back and rewatch these Ed puzzles. All right, I was looking at the Ed puzzles coming through, and it's like a 3 out of 5, a 2 out of 5. You got to go and do them again if you're still confused, because that's how we get good with genetics. We practice it. We practice Punnett squares. We practice with the vocab. And I need you to rewatch these Ed puzzles if you're still confused about anything. Some of it's going to become a little bit, it's going to get a little cohesive in your head when you do your study island. Your study island is going to help put some pieces together there, so that'll be good. Your vocabulary pulls some things together. The vocabulary packet, when you start looking through that and you're doing your reading, if you're doing all the components of this unit and you're putting some thought and effort into it, you're not just kind of faking it, you should be okay. But this is not a unit you can fake your way through. This builds upon itself, and the vocabulary builds on more vocabulary. And we're about to move into lesson 3 here. And I need you to do yourself a favor and go back and review those Ed puzzles. Make sure you're good to go before we move forward. And also just reach out if you want me to share my screen with you and talk you through anything that we've looked at so far. I don't want you going into today still having confusion. All right, so let's get into it. Today, we're going to be talking about some of the exceptions to Mendel's rules. So we said yesterday, Mendel came up with the idea that there's dominant and recessive characteristics out there. And so the big example is the pea plant example. And so this is the rule of dominance. The purple flower is going to have 2 capital letters. It's going to be dominant over the white flower. And so if these 2 flowers crossed, if he's homozygous, all of the offspring will be purple because the dominant allele masks the recessive allele. The other rule that Mendel taught us is dealing with segregation and independent assortment. And that goes back to meiosis. When these alleles are inherited from your parents, it's kind of just random chance if you're going to end up with a big P or a little p, because they separate independently from each other during anaphase of meiosis. Anaphase is the really important phase. So those are some of Mendel's basic rules. The big one is the dominant and recessive. What we're going to look at today are areas in nature where that doesn't always apply. And if you don't have a strong foundation to build on here, you might end up getting confused. So like I said, you're going to be mad. I'm going to say it again. Rewatch the lesson 1 and 2 Ed puzzle, because I want you to have a strong foundation to build on. So in exceptions to Mendel's rules, we have incomplete dominance, codominance, multiple alleles, polygenic traits, and sex-linked traits. I'm going to go through these, give you a few examples, and then it just comes down to memorization. So here we go. In an incomplete dominance situation, this is kind of how we thought genetics worked before Mendel came along. We pictured it as the paint can type of situation where you have a red flower and a white flower, but instead of one of them being dominant, they're both incompletely dominant. One allele is not going to mask the other, and you end up with something that's called an intermediate phenotype, a third phenotype, and that is a combination of the two. And I always think of incomplete dominance as the paint can effect. You take the colors, you stir them together, and you get that intermediate phenotype. Co-dominance is pretty cool because look at that guy. He's awesome. That's a speckled hen. And in co-dominance, instead of the colors stirring together, they end up both being equally present. So examples of co-dominance are the feathers that you see on a speckled hen, a black hen and a white hen. Are all hens female? The two chickens mate, and the phenotype of the offspring is a combination of both parents. One is not dominant over the other. They don't stir together. They are co-dominant. There's our definition for co-dominance. When we're writing codominance in a Punnett square, they both get a different capitalized letter. So again, this gets a little bit tricky because in this situation with our chicken friend, we would have capital B, capital B, capital W, capital W. And remember yesterday when I said we don't do that? We do when we're talking about the exceptions to Mendel's rules. So I think these chickens look pretty cool. All right. Multiple alleles. You see this a lot. You see it in human blood type, fur color. It's where you have genes that exist in more than two forms. Up until this point, we've been talking about Mendelian genetics because Gregor studied those either or characteristics in pea plants, and not everything is that convenient. So, multiple alleles occur where you have to have some of these superscripts to denote the specific allele for that phenotype, for that characteristic. So, multiple alleles, we see that all the time. Polygenic traits are another exception to Mendel's rule that explains some of the variety in the phenotypes of different species, different populations. So polygenic traits are produced by the interaction of several genes. Remember when we were looking and we were talking about the loci? Okay, and we said the locus for flower color is here on the dad chromosome and here on the mom chromosome. With polygenic traits, you might have a situation where when we're looking at the chromosomes, and this is not accurate, I'm just giving an example, but we might say that the genes for skin color are found here and here, but also here and here, and also here and here. So it's a combination of multiple alleles that mixes together to give the wide variety of traits in certain characteristics. So again, another exception to Mendel's rule, polygenic traits. They're patterns of inheritance that are controlled by more than one gene. Several genes contribute to the final phenotype of a given trait, and they typically are demonstrated on a spectrum from one extreme to the other and everything in between. Pretty cool. We also think about environmental conditions that can control gene expression. The phenotype of an organism is partially controlled by its genotype, but there's also some other things involved. You know, if you have a pet, you know, who you know its sibling, like if your uncle, you know, adopted a dog from the same litter that you did, you know that they're not identical to each other because they're being raised a little bit differently. If you know, have a goldfish that you know, overfeed, it's going to become a really big goldfish. So your environmental conditions play a role in your phenotype, but also how some of these genes are turned off or on. They're called Hox genes, and we're not going to get too into that But there are situations where gene expression isn't activated except during certain environmental conditions. So, there has to be appropriate conditions for the genes to be activated, and you see that in nature sometimes too. So, that's the role that the environment plays on the expression of your phenotype. And then finally, sex linked traits. These are pretty cool. In sex linked traits, they were discovered by Thomas Morgan, and he was observing fruit flies that had these albino type of eyes. Okay, so there were fruit flies that had white eyes and fruit flies that had these red eyes, and he couldn't figure out why certain flies had the red eyes. And he said the recessive white eyes were only common in male fruit flies. He almost never saw them. So the situation was that this characteristic for having these recessive white eyes is only carried on the X chromosome. So strange, right? If it's on the X chromosome, wouldn't that be coming through with mom? And it's not exactly. If we look at the way that they're passed, if your mom is XX and your dad is XY, if you are a male, you're an XY, and you don't have that other X to kind of mask the the trait in question. So with the fruit flies, for instance, that's the female that's carrying that red characteristic. So XX, here's a female fruit fly. XY, here's the male fruit fly. So he's going to end up having that white recessive. Did I say red a second ago? I'm sorry. He's going to end up having that white recessive characteristic because there isn't the other Y to mask it. I know that's a little bit confusing, and I do have another video to watch. It's got a few more examples with that. So when you're talking about sex-linked traits, you typically see them more in the male because there isn't that other Y to there isn't that other X that females have to mask them. Okay, so those are our four things. Those are our four exceptions to Mendel's rules. Incomplete dominance, think paint can. Co-dominance, think speckled hen or sharing. Multiple alleles, think about your bunnies, the fur color of bunnies, multiple alleles, different types of variation. Polygenic traits, look at the prefix there. Many genes control one trait. And sex-linked traits, think about traits that are only passed on the X chromosome, and that makes them typically more prevalent in male members of the species. All right, you know what's next, always. We've got the Amoeba Sisters video to watch. I also have a Lumen Learning. This was a really good website I found that does another fantastic job of explaining some of these exceptions to Mendel's rules. So don't take my word for it. If you want to learn a little bit more about incomplete dominance, codominance, sex-linked traits, there's our white-eyed fruit fly, Drosophila. And then there's another example showing how that works itself out. You've got your multiple alleles explained in terms of blood types. They even linked the Amoeba Sisters. Everybody loves the Amoeba Sisters. And a few other video reviews and things like that. So this is a really nice resource for you to review if you're not quite sure, or if you need a few more examples of what I went over. I highly recommend you skim through the Lumen Learning, watch some of the videos, and just get yourself prepared. So it is now time to read chapter 12.3 and complete the 12.3 reading quiz. Thank you for your time today.